The things that I am going to say, I might not even agree with them in another year's time, but maybe I will. Some of them I've believed for a long time. They're not coherently expressed. I don't have easy answers, and I have a lot of questions that have been rattling around for a long time and might intimated that perhaps I'm not the only person that worries about this stuff. So I'm just going to chuck some ideas out there and see where we end up. Yeah. I don't know if you've read my abstract, and that's not an invitation to start reading it now. It's just, I made some rather rash promises. I think I was promising myself that maybe by today I'd know the answers, but yeah, as usual, I just realised that the questions are deeper and more fish-hooky than I even wanted to admit at the time. I'm aware that my abstract suggests that I may be approaching this topic from a position whereby a traditional music education is considered invaluable, indispensable, and more so than other traditions perhaps. What this is really meant to be is an attempt at looking at a situation from many angles and thinking about what needs to happen. I may have a bone to pick with the purveyors of education of so-called commercial music, with their implication that by studying that curriculum's range of styles, one might ensure one might make a living out of music selling. I may have a thing or two to say to those who would sideline the real artistic benefits of a thorough musical education in the rush to justify an arts education for what it offers via so-called transferable skills. I certainly do have a thing or two to say to the short-sighted, artistically stunted minds that promote STEM, aka science, technology, engineering and maths, as being what students really need to learn in preference, and actually they frame it as being in opposition to the arts, which, as others have suggested, should really be included and respelled STEAM. But the fact is, things have changed. They are greatly different in tertiary education than they were even 10 years ago, and it's mostly tertiary education that I'm focusing on today. The world has changed, and the way most musicians make music is vastly different from the way it was. I'm talking particularly in the Western art world, but not exclusively. The world of music, the so-called industry, one's relationship to music communities, the way we get our music out there or not, is unrecognisable compared to the early 1980s when I was an undergraduate music student myself. Those days, by the way, were even before the days that our students now call back in the day. Harvard University recently provoked an uproar when it adopted a new curriculum model for its undergraduate degree in response to their recognition that the student body had a wider range of interests than was catered for by the old curriculum. Looking carefully at the distinction they needed to make between students who are musical, their words, yet lack a traditional, for which read Western art music, traditional musical background, and a perceived need for diversity, they put in place what they call an advising scheme that supports students creating their own pathways through a series of optional courses. There was initially a pretty strong negative reaction to this. There was an outcry about dumbing down, it was anti-education. John Adams got upset that the university might stop teaching its students the importance of notation. And all of us who have had notation at the centre of our musical activities are understandably anxious that its particular values might be thrown away. Nevertheless, the rise of popular music since the mid-20th century, followed by the digital revolution that has since occurred, has changed for the foreseeable future the fundamental skill set that a composer or music-making person needs to create music. It may be that in starting to comprehend the far-reaching effects of this fact, a traditionally trained musician might have a reaction that is, as the Harvard defenders found, essentially class-based. If the students that go to university haven't had at least 10 years of private music education before they come to university, then the old curriculum really doesn't serve them. So they're excluded on the basis of their parents' failure to or failure to be able to invest in their early music education. Some generalisations, you'll have to forgive me, but you know, I'm trying to get to a point, I'm not sure what it is. What if we were to agree that notated music is a subset of a wider thing that we might call encoded music? Other types of encoded music might include electroacoustic composition, recorded improvised or semi-improvised sessions, music performances that are a response to a graphic score, music generated by human-developed algorithms, or many other possibilities. The set of encoding practices that constitute music notation might be substituted with another. In fact, they actually already often are. And let's not turn to point the finger at Ableton Live or GarageBand. Douglas Lilburn sought a new kind of musical relevance in electronically generated, manipulated, and electromagnetically organised sound, and a generation of New Zealand composers found themselves inspired, or at least provoked, to make sense of the context and intent of their own music. The so-called and now rather tired, I think, quotes unquote new musicology movement of the 1980s sought to remind us, in case we had forgotten, because we do sometimes forget, the importance of context in appreciating a musical work. But let's not replace our interest in the work with a wholesale shift to an interest in context and pretend that the music doesn't count for anything. That's one of my bugbears, and yet it's sort of actually it's standing on its own soapbox over there in a slightly half-finished paragraph. So moving on. The next question is, what about quality? How do we know what's good? Heck, it's getting a bit difficult. And which essential skills should we be teaching now? Which courses should be considered compulsory? Which courses elective? Do we take the you don't know what's good for you, so we'll tell you what you have to do approach? Or do we take the you come in here knowing what you want and you just pick it off the shelf, here's the supermarket aisle of options and you fill your own trolley? Oops, heading for a difficult analogy there, won't go down that path anymore. What of and whither to Western art music? And then what about Māori music? The indigenous music of this place is very much an oral culture. There are many composer-performer traditions, as opposed to the recent Western art music model of the composer who writes it down and the performer who interprets the score. Singer-songwriters, jazz musicians, many but not all popular music traditions, traditional music such as Māori performance practices and the musics of folk traditions. They're part of the plethora of composer-performer traditions. And many Western art musicians over the centuries also occupied that performer-composer space. Yet music degrees in New Zealand currently require students to decide which they are as they come in to the university, often from the very beginning of their undergraduate degree, unless they're jazz musicians, in which case the rules are different. Which takes me to a slight anecdote. Many years ago, when I was working for a different university, I had the pleasure of spending a day sitting at a table in one of those kind of open day parents and short people walk up to you and ask you questions about your degree. So I was sitting at the School of Music table, and the next table was someone from the jazz program, which at that time was in a different school in the same university. And a potential student walked up to the other person and asked, what is the difference between doing a degree in jazz and a degree in music, Bachelor of Music degree? And the person who was responsible for the jazz program at the time said, well, the difference is that jazz is music with no rules. Implications being serious and far-reaching, and not to mention it was wrong. So it was hard to know how to respond in that particular situation. I mean, you can't just elbow your colleague and say, "Oi, that's a load of rubbish." and I've heard of a few rules in jazz, some jazz sometimes, but anyway, it's just part of the problem I'm trying to tell you about, but it may be that you share it occasionally. So for musicians who spend a lot of their creative activities in the composer, performer and collaborative areas, what might a relevant composition education look like? What might we include and how? What might we miss out? And what would the loss of that mean? For example, how bad would it be if our graduates didn't immediately recognise Beethoven's Ninth Symphony, or for that matter, Stravinsky's The Rite of Spring? How bad would it be? It's a serious question. Universities deliver programs that are made of courses, and their graduates need to meet graduate profiles in the allotted time. That is the tertiary education model that we're working with. Now, if you want to join QAP or NZQA and subvert from within, that's terrific. But the older I get, the more finite life obviously proves itself to be, and I'm not going to take that path. So I'm sticking with the model that I know I've got at the moment, and that is courses and graduate profiles. And I'm trying to sort of manage that along with a team. I'm not doing it on my own. 21st century education, unlike any other before it, requires at its heart the development of, I believe, critical thinking skills. And in the case of Harvard-based musicians, as they said themselves in the articles I've read, critical listening skills. This is different from our earlier education model, whereby the information or content is handed down from one generation to another in the classroom. That sort of information, the sort of content stuff, may be Googled within seconds. And although much of what might be found is not entirely reliable, I'm sure you won't disagree with me that quite a bit of what used to be said in the classroom wasn't necessarily reliable either. This is not to say that I think we can all learn everything we need from our own homes via Google. Access to a range of information has never been even slightly so easy before. But knowing what to make of this avalanche of stuff is a highly developed set of skills, and one in which an education, formal or otherwise, can play a vital part. Critical thinking, careful sifting, knowing what questions to ask, and who to ask sometimes, and recognising when there is a gap or a discrepancy or a space in which answers are not forthcoming. These are necessary for a life that is fully engaged in one's creative potential, engaged in the world, engaged in skillful craft and artistic practice. I've complained in my abstract about the garbling of such words as classical, genre and accessible. They're just three of my kind of alarm bells go off words. I'll deal with the last one first. Something is not inaccessible just because a lot of people haven't taken the trouble to engage with it. Artists don't generally hide the key to their work. They may simply not be producing something that is instantly recognisable as being made or intended in the same way as something else that the wider population may have already encountered. This is not inaccessibility. Inaccessibility is not being able to get to something. It's not performed, it's not available in the shops, it's destroyed, or nobody knows it's there. Inaccessibility is not the inability to get, apprehend, appreciate, or grok something. So I've complained about inaccessibility, but I hope that you can see that that's the opposite of accessibility. It used to be. Genre is now a word that's so bandied about that it's got a frequent mispronunciation. I've been tending to call it genre myself on occasions. It's kind of code for, I've heard something like this before, it belongs here in my music collection. It's a way of numbing one's listening to something or making one's ears glaze over but assigning it to a category about which rigid opinions have already been formed. Hence, I like all kinds of music, country and western, or reggae and hip-hop. I did hear that not so long ago, or Bach and Schubert. Haven't heard that recently, but I wouldn't be surprised. Oh my goodness, just like that. Okay. It is perfectly understandable that there will be a process of othering an artistic practice that is not like our own. This othering springs from a fear of what the other might have, may know, may enjoy, and may be capable of, and the othering occurs in every direction. The garbling of the label classical is in many ways the most curious. For musicians, the classical period, officially a period of Western art music creation between approximately 1750 and 1830, was one in which writing for orchestra and string quartets developed remarkably, and there was a focus on proportion and structural linkages. That is generally not what is meant by the wider population when they refer to classical today. It is more likely to signal an orchestral sound might be included, or there is a string section, or there are a few virtuosic passages. One of the more bizarre claims to classical that's presented itself to me in the last few months has been the critical acclaim ascribed to Shane Carter's latest album, Offsider, which, because he has enthusiastically taken up piano and included his very amateur performance on the instrument on every track, is now being hailed as his classical album. Since when did the inclusion of 2 or 3 piano chords in fast rotation change the fundamental intention and context of a set of songs? Which is not to say that an amateur-sounding piano part doesn't have its inherent charms, outsider art, offsider art, but that does not mean that the affected output suddenly erupts into a genre called classical. Carter's harmonic palette here is neither more nor less harmonically curious than his earlier works. His song structure is neither more nor less balanced or organised. He's an interesting singer-songwriter who has decided to include a lot of piano in his world for now. It appears to be neither more nor less popular than his earlier albums, but the ways in which that might be measured are not something I want to go into today, and nor will might let me because I'm running out of time. What appears to be true is that in the case of the critical acclaim of Shane Carter's album, a false dichotomy can be seen between popular and classical. And false dichotomies appear across the board, as I mentioned in my abstract. Classical and contemporary, not a dichotomy. Some music is both, and a great deal of music is neither. Classical and jazz, must we choose one or the other? Honest and pretentious. So how do I go about proving that I honestly mean the music I've written, or at least I did when I wrote it? Who am I trying to convince? Will I get away with it? Acoustic and digital, which is really about how the sounds are made, not what they sound like. The dichotomy of university and community, 2 things which I certainly wish to see coming closer together, and certainly not things that we should ever wish to see opposing each other. A local composer around here, once a long time ago, self-described himself to me as a community composer, pointing out that was the opposite of a university composer. And there was an ugly dispute between the University of Canterbury and the community pre-Quake about the School of Music's previous attempt to come back into the city centre. Things have changed a lot. There are reasons. And music's relationship to nature, but I won't go into that right now because suddenly I'm running out of time. No, I'm going to say that. Is natural music better than unnatural music? How could that be? All art is artifice. That is its definition. Somebody made it. We can look to our human experience of nature's patterns, nature's glorious features, and enjoy the analogic or affective relationship between our human enjoyment of nature and of music. But a resonance of one joyous experience in another domain of human expression and experience does not mean those 2 things are directly connected. We have made a connection. So you're going to have to forgive me slightly because I have to get to the non-punchline. So what might a truly relevant education for an emerging composer look like? And how can we talk meaningfully about the value of an education in this area? My quick answer this week, at least, is flexibility, adaptability, inclusivity, an attempt to offer relevant learning environment and opportunities for the individual. The dialogic that Alison was talking of, not the dialectic and dying model of the composer as superhuman genius. We need ways to create courses where the essential structures are in place, but the individual students are assessed on the basis of largely personalised assignments. Surely in composition teaching of all things, this cannot be such a new idea. And we can't be expert teachers in all the areas our students are interested in. Sometimes the most we can do is facilitate learning and learn alongside. It would limit the student and ultimately ourselves if we weren't prepared to go with students into areas where we know less and might discover more. We must move away from the idea of the protégé. So in my abstract, I asked the question, should we be talking about composition or should we be talking about new music? 2 paragraphs. And I made a rather rash promise of suggestions for curriculum development. Here at the University of Canterbury, there are 3 majors, and when I developed the curriculum with my predecessor 4 years ago, he added the words in bracket composition after the new music major in order to explain it. And I'm still trying to weed that adaptation out of some of the publicity documentation. Composition can mean many things, and so many of them are problematic. This is, I know, a bit strong coming from someone who was president of the Composers Association for 10 years, but there you have it. What I can be immensely disappointed by is the low expectations students sometimes have of their own music-making abilities, and what I'm immensely excited by is to see how students' musical horizons can grow by real engagement in making, but even more in listening. Our students need to be listening actively, and we need to be listening with them and sharing what we've been listening to with them. Not so that they know what the right answer is or what they should be able to hear, but to recognise what they do actually hear and where that takes their imaginations, their memories, their ideas. Listening is an active process. Analysis is an active process. Likewise, music making in any form. I wouldn't dream of saying where music making will go in the next 10 years, but I do know that we must retain an open mind and be aware of how personal our responses are to any music. I'll stop there. Thank you.